Hi, everybody. Am I recording? Hi, everybody. I'm going to try this time by ordinary video and see if this works better. It's week 2, as you know, and I hope you're okay, that you're bearing up, you're keeping safe and keeping sane and keeping afloat. I know it's very, very, very tough these days. So wherever you are and whatever your situation is, this is enormously challenging to everybody, but some more than others, I know, and I hope you're getting the assistance and support you need. So again, if you need anything, if there's anything you do to help, please get in touch. This is a strange time to be thinking about Hegel in a way. The phenomenology at this moment must seem to be very dry and distant, 200 years old, with this strange language and weirdly convoluted thinking. And it seems very, very old as we read it now. But at the same time, it suddenly seems to leap out of us as if it were written yesterday, or at least that's how I'm finding as I look at this text again, you know, in the context of the current crisis. Now that we've gone into global lockdown mode, all of us, you know, more or less told to stay in solitary confinement, but all together in this coordinated isolation, all disconnected, as a result of this global interconnection that has produced the emergency that it's produced, and all invaded by this buzz of constant information from around the globe. I'm just, you know, I'm really asking myself the question, could there be a more graphic demonstration, but also a more diabolical inversion of the truth of Hegel's assertion of regarding the inextinguishable sociability, the universality of the human being, the I that is we and the we that is I in his formula. Throughout the spirit chapter, as you know, Hegel's been casting about again and again for a social form adequate to express this universality. We've seen him analyzing one political structure after another, from Greek democracy through absolute monarchy and beyond, as we'll see next time. And each time he discovers and shows just how and why each form of organization failed to provide the institutional embodiment that would be adequate to the universal demands of spirit. Next week, as you know, we'll be moving on to revolutionary France, Hegel's depiction of the revolutionary terror, where we'll find yet another failure of universality. Hang on. As for today, I'm asking, could there be a more graphic indication that Hegel's search is not over, that we've not yet even begun to find a political form in which the universal human subject might thrive or even survive? We've not yet found a way to make sense of this slogan, which is also an imperative to affirm the speculative identity of the I and the we. What kind of governance will be adequate to the universality that defines our fragile humanity, the pressures on which are as evident today as they've ever been? Surely the current situation makes this question, which is really Hegel's question, unavoidable and urgent. There's a strange synchronicity here. I obviously didn't time it this way. When I planned the course, it just happened. But just as we've come to the point of this week's readings, suddenly the theme of infection, of a universal infection, leaps off the page of the phenomenology. Specifically, paragraph 545 is what I want to look at. But this isn't the first time that this theme, infection, has presented itself. It's been lurking in the text from the beginning. And if you go back and start rereading the phenomenology, and this is what happens every time you reread the book, which is why Hegel insisted that it could only be actually read the second time round, you'll see that it's already shown up. This theme of infection has already shown up quietly without causing any ruckus, as if it were a germ cell that was silently lurking in the background all along, but has suddenly become virulent or viral. Sorry, I was trying to pause the video. So in last week's lecture, talking about paragraph 508, I was considering how Hegel describes language generally, that is, all language, as having this viral or contagious quality. He defines language as this universal infection that transmits subjectivity as if subjectivity itself were a communicable disease, which makes us think again maybe about the meaning of the word communication. So selfhood or subjectivity is inherently expansive, self-replicating, self-multiplying. It has an epidemic quality. It is constituted, the subject is constituted precisely by virtue of being a speaking subject as a universal subject. It's in this way that Hegel says, speaks of the I that is we. I am we because I speak, and in being a speaking subject. It's language that both reveals but also enables the inherently plural, pluralizing, proliferating structure of the human subject. And language itself behaves like a virus. It travels from host to host. It lives on as meaning after it has died off, as sound. It seems to survive its own physical destruction, which is why it's able to travel. And precisely all these things are what it means to be a speaking subject. This is what it means to be a subject. So in paragraph 508, this was the first time that the link between language and infection and subjectivity was made so explicit. But spirit really has been infected all along, and we've known this, or we should have known this, at least since the master-slave episode, when the sociability, the fundamental sociability of consciousness first became explicit. The infection, let's just call it other people for short, is not something that arrives from the outside or accidentally. It's inherent to the structure of subjectivity itself. And it arrives in the first instance as mortal terror. So if you go back to paragraph 196, that's the very intense, very vivid paragraph in the master-slave section that we looked at quite a bit, and it's on your handout for today. Paragraph 196, Hegel spoke of fear as pervading the slave's body and mind, like a ravaging infection that had penetrates to every pore of his existence. And he stressed the need for that, the need for an absolute infection. We need to think a little bit more closely about this. What does it mean that fear, mortal fear, is constitutive of the self? Not just that we're anxious or nervous or neurotic creatures, but that subjectivity itself is constituted through fear, through global, unremitting, total fear, the kind that shakes and shatters us in all the ways that Hegel describes in that paragraph. What does it mean that our relationship with others is essentially mediated through death? We are infected by others because we are infected by death, at the very moment in which we are infected by death, in which we experience that our life itself is at stake. But it's also the other way around. Our relationship to death is always mediated through other people. There is no such thing as an asocial or a non-social death, a purely natural or biological death, as the Antigone episode showed so clearly. Next week, when we look at the section on absolute freedom and terror, that's Hegel's reading in the French Revolution, we're going to look at how this infectious fear unfolds in a political context. But this was something that had been prepared for, I think, in the master-slave section. So we're going to bring that in as well. We're going to begin to grasp the measure and the meaning of this infection that was announced from the beginning. It's like almost taking its temperature. But for now, we're watching Spirit. We're watching Spirit move on. And we're going to see from where it was last week. And we'll see another variant of infection enter the scene. So as you know, Spirit is pushing on. It's pushing past the Hall of Mirrors that was absolute monarchy, past the heap of ornaments clustering around the throne, telling the monarch that he was a monarch, and so on, past the madness of the disrupted consciousness, pushing through all that dissonance, all that fragmentation, all that culture. And Spirit now assumes the shape of Enlightenment. And it's the French Enlightenment that's the model here. And we can talk a little bit later about the oddness of this map between Hegel's phenomenological account of consciousness and what seems to be also an account of the historical cultural trajectory of modern Europe. Should the phenomenology of spirit have been called the phenomenology of Northern European spirit? This is a question that we might come back to ask. But how, in any case, we're moving on. And one thing we haven't really settled is how does the torn or the witty consciousness pull itself out of the abyss that it's generated? As I asked in last week's lecture, why would it even bother to extricate itself? What would be its motivation, given that it seems to be entirely at home in its own contradictoriness? And up to now, contradiction has been the motor of a dialectical movement. It's the unbearability of contradiction that has pushed consciousness each time to find another shape, to extricate itself from an impossible, stance. So why and how does the disrupted consciousness overcome itself, given that everything seems to be, completely disrupted without any obvious either any obvious opportunity or motivation for transcending this. So this may be it might seem like one of those magical moments that you sometimes come to in Hegel, where everything seems to be most lost. Suddenly there's a turnaround and things just pick up again and move on. The recuperation was already signaled in paragraph 518. If you can look at your handout, I've got to find my own. Sorry, just one second. I'll pause again. Okay, back again. Sorry. So already in paragraph 518 on your handout, Hegel had spoken of what he calls an absolute, what he describes as an absolute elasticity, whereby consciousness is somehow able to stretch or rise above its own alienation and to supersede what he calls its own supersession of itself. He's over to overcome its own self-cancellation. But the turning point, that is to say, to retrieve the first person, the robust first person standpoint, just where it seemed to have been most eviscerated. But the turning point seems to be most explicit in paragraph 526, where Hegel introduces a kind of self-referential logic whereby the witty consciousness, in dissolving everything around him, also dissolves itself. It's kind of variant on skepticism, I suppose. Hegel writes, the vanity of things is its own vanity. It itself is vain. And I've put the emphasis here on own and itself. That is to say, we are, returning to selfhood, to identity, in the midst of this profound non-identity, or rupture. So it's this, and so only, he says, to continuing this paragraph, only a self-consciousness in revolt is it aware of its own disrupted state, and in thus knowing, it has immediately risen above it. So it's as if somehow in thinking disruptedness in a coherent way, one is retrieving coherence from that very experience of rupture. So spirit manages to retrieve itself. It retrieves itself to retrieve, so that there is so that there is in itself, to which it can return. It finds identity in its own non-identity. It finds integrity in its tornness. This is why in paragraph 520, Hegel speaks of an absolute self-identity in absolute tornness. And it's in this way, I think in 522, he speaks of this strain of reconciliation, that is finding in these subversive depths, of the torn consciousness, the all-powerful note, he says, that returns spirit to itself. So the torn consciousness is moving beyond the antinomies, the contradictions that it's been so frantically uncovering, and this is the absolute elasticity that Hegel refers to in paragraph 518. So we can come back to this in the question session, in our regular class time today, later, I hope. Okay, so this introduces, with this jump, with this bouncing, this elasticity, this puts a new pressure, a new requirement on consciousness. It has to make good on this newfound sense of self-identity. It has to make sense of thought's ascendancy, of the triumph, of thinking over its own disruption. And this is precisely where enlightenment enters the scene. Enlightenment, under the name of insight originally, is the successor stage to the disrupted consciousness. And the ocular or the visual aspect is crucial here. These names are important. Insight, enlightenment. We're talking about clear-sightedness, lucidity, clarity, light. And as we'll see, a crucial aspect of light is that it needs something to illuminate. Enlightenment isn't just enlightenment, it needs to enlighten. It needs other people to enlighten. It needs to shed light on something that is not yet illuminated, that's something that's not yet enlightened about itself. Otherwise it wouldn't be enlightenment. So in other words, enlightenment can't function by itself. Light cannot light without darkness. Enlightenment needs to find an object in need of illumination. It needs obscurity, it needs opacity, it needs blindness, precisely so that it can be itself, so that it can penetrate this darkness. And what better object for enlightenment than the beliefs, the customs, the practices that have become fossilized through habit. Practices that seem irrefutable, irresistible, unquestionable, natural. In other words, faith or religion, which enlightenment insists on calling superstition. And this what enlightenment is going to be doing, and how in this section is exactly what was happening in the actual French Enlightenment in the 18th century, as the French philosophe Voltaire, among others, took on the church, took on the monarchy, which was wedded to the church, took on the aristocracy, took on the whole class structure that was sustained by unthinking habit and prejudice. But enlightenment needs an object that is benighted, that is unenlightened, It needs superstition so that it can have something to mask, to expose, to illuminate. This is the only way it can be enlightenment. So if there wasn't some blind, if there wasn't some opacity waiting for enlightenment to shed its light, enlightenment would have to invent that. And this is kind of what it's doing. It needs to feel it needs to feel that its brightness is unique. It's completely its own. It needs to feel that it's completely different, completely immune from the obscurity, from the blindness of its object. In other words, that it has nothing in common with religion. It has to enlighten religion from the outside, from an external perspective, as if it itself were completely exempt from the illusions, but also from the as it will turn out to be, from the truths or half truths that religion is also trying to think. So it has to maintain this this false sense of distance or difference, from its target, religion or faith, even though, in fact, as its own behavior shows, enlightenment has everything in common with religion, and its very zealousness in trying to convert religion, so to speak, convert religion to the cause of enlightenment, already in itself shows signs of this enmeshment. It's behaving in a very pious fashion. So on the one hand, enlightenment is an escalation or intensification of the disruptive state of mind that was the torn, that inherits from the torn consciousness. The torn consciousness is not only torn, it needs to tear. It needs everything to be torn to shreds as well. And insight shares this destructive desire. It needs to disrupt. It needs to create a disturbance. It needs to tear everything down. That's what the light does. It doesn't let the shadows live anymore. Which means that it has to find something that it can disturb. What better candidate than faith here? But on the other hand, so enlightenment is an exacerbation of the torn consciousness. But on the other hand, it's a step beyond this disruption. It is spirit's attempt to stabilize itself, to regain the authority, the certainty, the universality of the first person subject. So enlightenment and faith here enter as twins. They're apparently conflicting. They are positioned as antithetical. Both have a large stake in maintaining this antithesis as being essential to their individual identities, but they are ultimately enmeshed. And as we're going to see in a minute, this enmeshment is described as a kind of infection. This is where we're going. Both enlightenment and faith are trying in some way to do the same thing. Both are trying to move beyond the disintegration into which culture has just collapsed, and a disintegration which seems to be intrinsic or endemic to culture itself. Both are trying to find what Hegel had called in that earlier paragraph, 522, the all-powerful note that restores spirit to itself. Both are trying to express this, again, paragraph 520 here, this absolute self-identity in absolute tornness. We can describe the contrast between the two approaches as the contrast between an otherworldly and a secular strategy. Faith is trying to surmount to get beyond the alienation of culture by turning away from the world of culture towards what it calls a simple essence, let's call it God for short, which it enjoys in restful contemplation. So it wants to look away and just look towards something that is still and stable and permanent. So in some way, faith is a successor to the honest consciousness that we saw in the Diderot section, who just wants things to be as they are. Insight tries to do the same. It tries to surmount alienation, not by turning away from the world, but by looking through the world of culture, in order to expose the alienations of culture to itself. So we have, a manifest contrast between an attitude of retreat and an attitude of combat. But it's crucial that both faith and enlightenment are doing the same thing, that both share the same attitude to the world. Both are acting out a negative relationship to a world that has been stripped of meaning. Okay, hang on a second. I can try to. So faith tries to retrieve meaning by looking beyond, by looking somewhere, looking up, looking over, looking beyond, looking outside to an otherworldly, transcendent being. Let's call it God, because he is talking about God. For insight, on the other hand, it's the enlightened human consciousness, self-consciousness, that is the locus of meaning. Insight demolishes all external, the belief in all external cultural reality, by submitting it to the really corrosive power of the ego. Faith tries to turn away from the existing cultural world. Insight turns against it. So that's there's a basic difference in attitude, but they share the key thing is that they share the same project. Both faith and enlightenment are trying to do the same thing by seemingly, and I stress the seemingly, opposite means. And this is why faith and insight are as entangled as any other couple that we've encountered so far in the phenomenology: master and slave, Creon and Antigone, wealth and power, and so on. 541, paragraph 541, each is for the other the sheer negative of itself. They mirror each other. And this entanglement will prove to be all the more toxic, not necessarily tragic, the way Creon and Antigone's entanglement was tragic, but toxic, because the two sides cannot see their own entanglement. And what I want to dwell on here is that this entanglement is experienced, it's registered precisely as a kind of infection, which turns out to be a reciprocal infection. So enlightenment, comes on the scene as a pathogen that attacks faith. And faith, it invades faith, it contaminates faith, it introduces, it infects faith with this seemingly incurable disease for which there is no vaccination. And faith mobilizes an antigen that in turn attacks and debilitates enlightenment. It shows enlightenment to be not so enlightened about itself, as Hegel says. But the key thing is that the infection is in neither case something that's being introduced from the outside. Each party is able to infect the other party because they are already mutually contaminated, but without knowing it. Enlightenment can infect faith. It can get under its skin. It can kind of undermine faith by seeping into all its beliefs and making them not so secure any longer, precisely because faith is already enlightened. It shares the rationality of enlightenment without really recognizing it. And one proof of this enmeshment is that faith is so eager to argue back and make such very good arguments against enlightenment's own arguments against faith. and faith is able to marshal its antibodies against the Enlightenment and to actually turn them into antigens that will attack the source of its own infection. It can defend itself against Enlightenment, can infect Enlightenment, precisely because the Enlightenment unwittingly shares faith's own unreflective trust or faith in the power of thought itself. So, in other words, what faith shares with Enlightenment is faith. What Enlightenment shares with faith is enlightenment. So enlightenment can only infect faith because faith is already infected with the germ of rationality, and faith can only infect or undermine enlightenment because enlightenment itself is already infected with this germ of faith, which presents itself as this kind of credulity or lack of suspicion about itself, this kind of overweening trust in its own powers, and so on. So let's look at how this struggle, because Hegel presents it as a combat, an armed combat, but also more insidious combat between faith and insight. Insight, which I'm taking to be, just for convenience here, synonymous with enlightenment, is defined as pure negativity. Pure thought, I'm looking at paragraph 529 here. Pure thought as the absolute notion in the might of its negativity, which eliminates everything objective that supposedly stands over against consciousness. So by virtue of being insight, or enlightenment, consciousness positions itself as pure negativity, which can only define itself, like every negativity, as a determinate negativity that needs something to negate. It needs an opacity to illuminate. It needs an obscurity to enlightenment, to not lighten. And this is why it seizes on faith as its inevitable antithesis, because this is the counter, this is the counter enlightened, the non-enlightened object par excellence as far as enlightenment is concerned. So here we and this is why this is how the struggle begins. At first, very one-sidedly, as an attack by faith, attack on faith by insight, using two seemingly opposed strategies, which turn out to be actually the same strategy, or two sides of the same strategy. So on the one hand, and this is this key paragraph 545, which is where I wanted to, was where I've been heading today. Paragraph 545, enlightenment attacks faith as a kind of infection. It invades faith as a perfume. It infiltrates faith. It passes through the environment invisibly and irresistibly. It's a kind of germ warfare, and we could spend a lot of time in this passage, and maybe we will in the discussion period, for those of you who come to that. It's kind of diffuse. It spreads. It insinuates itself. It gets under faith's skin. So there's a kind of, as if reason is spreading from person to person by a kind of viral logic. Is just catching on. Now, this was actually how Voltaire, one of the French, Enlightenment philosophers, had actually described Enlightenment thinking. He had described religion itself as an illness, as a kind of contagion, as a mass hysteria, for which he says the only remedy for this epidemic is the spirit of philosophy, which he introduces. He wants to introduce as a kind of counter poison, precisely because it communicates. Rationality communicates, and it can be it can be the counterpoison that will work against the virus of faith. Hegel notes in this paragraph that one way in which the infection is both irresistible. There's no immunity from this, but it's also incurable, because any effort by faith to fight the disease can only exacerbate it. The struggle, he says, is too late. If faith tries to argue back, if it gives reasons why the Enlightenment is being unreasonable or irrational in its objections to faith, this only shows in arguing in the first place, in drumming up the energy and the motivation to counter-argue, to debate the Enlightenment. It only shows it's already accepted the premises of Enlightenment itself, which is that argument wins the day. So the second strategy, so the first strategy was infection. The second strategy seems at first to be somewhat different, but actually turns out to be the same. Is an assault from the outside, as if Enlightenment is not introducing germ warfare, more like throwing missiles or bombs from the other side of the river. The Enlightenment, I'm quoting from paragraph 538, comes on the scene as sheer uproar and violent struggle with its antithesis. This is very different from the description of infection, which is insidious and quiet and calm, right? But there's a kind of boomerang or ricochet effect that Hegel describes, in that every attack that Enlightenment makes on its object not only misses the mark because it's a misguided attack. It's a bad argument that it's leveling, but it exposes, in so doing, it exposes insight to an identical counter attack by faith on itself, which casts doubt on the entire Enlightenment project. So this section of the phenomenology is actually easy to read. Everything's relative here, but in terms of the phenomenology, this is one of the more straightforward sections. Hegel, rehearses very quickly many of the standard 18th century Enlightenment attacks on organized religion. It's a kind of a five-pronged attack, which I don't want to go through because it's actually quite legible without commentary. The point is that each time the attack by Enlightenment ricochets back on Enlightenment itself, precisely because it's misrecognized what it's attacking and what its attack is saying about itself. It's underestimating the profound continuity, similarity, even identity between itself and what it attacks, between Enlightenment and faith. So we can, very quickly, there's the objection that faith is a projection, that it's an anthropomorphic fantasy, that is a kind of fetish, that God is a human product created in God's image rather than the other way around, as Christianity would have it. That faith is a mass deception perpetrated by an evil priesthood to oppress the populace, the people, which was more or less Voltaire's objection to organized religion. Thirdly, that faith is the worship of graven images, that it's a kind of idolatry. Fourthly, that faith relies on unreliable historical documentation to prove its point. And finally, that faith engages in absurd actions like sacrifice. It does foolish things, like why would you give up meat for Lent, and so on and so forth. It serves no purpose, and so on. So each time I don't think we have to get into this now. I'm happy to if you want to pursue this outside. Each time Hegel shows that these are all bad arguments, they misconstrue what faith is all about. Faith has excellent arguments for each and every one of them. And Hegel's very generous in coaching faith. He kind of gives faith all the arguments that it needs to refute Enlightenment's claims. All the arguments are false precisely because they underestimate the rationality of faith. These arguments overlook the fact that faith itself is actually engaged in exactly the same project as Enlightenment. And in so doing, in underestimating faith, it's also overestimating the rationality of Enlightenment itself. This is why Hegel says in this wonderful phrase, Enlightenment is less than enlightened about itself. It misunderstands both its object and itself. It understands what either faith or enlightenment are all about. So it's not enlightenment. It fails to understand its own faith, the faith that is operated in it, the faith in reason, its own trust in truth, its own blindness about its own illuminating power. And it fails to, it shows this incomprehension every time it insists on distancing itself from faith, in leveling its attacks on faith as if it were outside faith, as if it were standing on one shore and throwing its missile, over to the other shore, as if they were living in, as if it was living in a completely different zone than faith, or every time it tries to infect faith, as if it weren't, in being the source of infection, already infected, and furthermore infected by its object, infected by its victim, infected by the faith that it's trying to infect with the spirit of rationality. So the more insight tries to distance itself from faith, the more it shows itself to be contaminated by faith, or just contaminated, period. In believing itself to be uncontaminated, it shows itself to be contaminated. I'm just going to pause this 1 second. Let me drink of water. So Enlightenment's false belief in its own purity, in its own immunity from its object, from faith, this false belief in purity is itself its impurity, precisely because it's a belief. It's an ungrounded presupposition. It's not anything that can be, that has been or can be proved rationally. This is why in paragraph 548, Hegel speaks of the defilement, or the contamination, the sullying. It's the rendering unpure of enlightenment through the adoption of itself identical purity of a negative attitude. So its purity is what makes it most impure, because it's where enlightenment is most faith-like. And I want to pause here with this scene of total reciprocal infection, a reciprocity that testifies to the fact that the infection has been there from the start, that it is constitutive of rationality, constitutive of human subjectivity, evidenced in language, not just the particular language we speak, but by the very fact of language as Hegel presents it. I'm going to stop here at the scene of mutual total infection, and kind of with another cliffhanger, because how do we get out of this? And next time we're going to move on in our final session to the theme of infection and fear, and see how the experience of the experience of revolutionary terror, and it's the French Revolution he's talking about, or thinking about here at least. How this scene of absolute terror comes about as a response to this mutual contamination of faith and insight. So how does this fear follow the dialectic of the Enlightenment, and in doing so, as I was saying before, this really picks up a theme which Hegel had introduced quietly at the very beginning of the spirit section, in fact, before, in paragraph 196 of the Master-Slave section. So I want to return to that paragraph 196, where Hegel speaks of this total fear that has infected the mind, body, and soul of the slave, to really see how this fear will get elaborated at a more complex level. So that's it for now. I'll see you. I'll see some of you if you want to discuss anything at 1 o'clock today, Tuesday, March 24th, and I will. I'll see you next week, or you'll see me next week at least, with our final session on fear and infection, looking at the section on absolute freedom and terror. Okay. Write to me, contact me, come to the discussion class, email me if you want to discuss anything further, and I'll sign off now. Okay, see you later.